Now, there are many things about this subject that, like the shadow, have the power to cloud men's minds. And one of them is the fact that the jihad advance into Europe did end in 1683. And then we didn't see, at least on that largest scale, jihad warfare until relatively recently, until the last few decades of the 20th century. Many people believe that at that point, this was because of some kind of a reformation in the Islamic world that led to the discarding of the ideology that had fueled these conquests to begin with. That ideology was based on the teachings of the Quran and on the directions of Muhammad the Prophet, who said that the Muslims must beat the unbelievers in battle, offer them conversion to Islam. If they refused conversion, then to offer them second-class status under the rule of the Islamic State. If they refused both, then to go to war with them. This was the ideology that fueled the conquests, based on the assumption that it was part of the responsibility of the Muslim community, the Ummah, to wage war in order to establish the hegemony of the Islamic social order over the world. Now here again, this is another thing that clouds men's minds. Islam was not spread by the sword in the sense that most people understand the term. People think that these armies swept into North Africa and the Middle East and up into Europe, and they forced people to convert. They did not. They subjugated them as dhimmis. They made them second-class citizens. They weren't actually, strictly speaking, citizens at all. And they enforced various institutionalized stipulations of discrimination against them, which were so onerous, particularly the tax, the jizya, that they had to pay, from which Muslims were exempt, that conversions became the only pathway to a better life for these people. And so there were conversions that would result, but they were not, strictly speaking, forced. The wars were designed to establish the hegemony of Islamic law. As Maududi, the great Pakistani Muslim theorist of the 20th century, put it, non-Muslims have absolutely no right to wield the reins of power in any part of God's earth. And if they do, it is the responsibility of Muslims to do whatever is necessary to dislodge them from that power. Now, what happened then? In 1683, it became simply impossible for this jihad to be pursued because of the weakness of the Ottoman Empire and the decline in strength generally of the Islamic civilization. It was not a matter of setting aside these doctrines, it was only a matter of not being strong enough to pursue them. Now, of course, in our own age, because of the Khomeini revolution in Iran, because of Saudi oil billions, it has again become possible to take up this war again. And so people believe, because we have not seen this to such a scale, on such a scale until the last few decades, that it is something newly minted. It is not. It is something radically traditional. It is something that is very old, deeply rooted within the Islamic religion, and that is being reasserted today. Now, of course, today what is happening in Europe is very different. There are no invading armies. There is just a demographic revolution. Today, there are several countries, notably Holland, France, and Germany, where the non-Muslim population is either not growing at all or actively declining, and the Muslim population is growing so rapidly that probably by mid-century or shortly thereafter, there will be Islamic majorities in those countries, unless something drastically changes. And then, because of the political imperatives that are inherent within Islam, and have been from the beginning, there will be calls in those states and others in Europe to establish Islamic law there. Sheikh Qaradawi, who is well known as one of the most influential Islamic teachers in the world, he has been hailed as a moderate leader by the mayor of London, as well as by John Esposito, the scholar of Islam at the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. Here is a quote from Qaradawi that I think is very important to keep in mind as a backdrop to understanding what's happening in Europe today. Qaradawi said, "The Prophet Muhammad was asked, 'What city will be conquered first, Constantinople or Rome?' He answered, 'The city of Heraclius will be conquered first, that is Constantinople.' The city of Heraclius was conquered in 1453. Rome remains, and we hope and believe that it too will be conquered. This means that Islam will return to Europe as a conqueror and victor, after being expelled from it twice, once from the south, from Andalusia, and a second time from the east, when it knocked several times on the door of Athens." I'm not quite sure what he means by that, because actually they did conquer Athens, they just didn't Islamize the population. Anyway, Qaradawi continues, I maintain that this conquest this time will not be by the sword, but by preaching and ideology. Islam will return to Europe, and the Europeans will convert to Islam. Then they themselves will be able to be the ones to disseminate Islam to the world more than the ancient Muslims. That last sentence may be the most important thing he said. I mean, obviously he's reaffirmed an imperialism, an expansionism. He's quite forthright about it, even though, paradoxically enough, no Western leaders have yet acknowledged that this imperialism exists. But in any case, at the end he says, then they themselves will be able to be the ones to disseminate Islam to the world, more than the ancient Muslims. So he is envisioning an Islamic Europe that will disseminate Islam to the world. Now imagine the position of the United States in a situation in which you have Islamic states in Europe. What will be the state of our alliances and our ability to act in the world? This will be the means by which the Islamic empire that Qaradawi envisions in Europe will be able to extend power over the United States as well and neutralize American power in the world once and for all. The demographic trends in the United States are not nearly as dire as they are in Europe. And the Islamization of the United States is something that is more or less in the realm of fantasy rather than a terrible and verging reality as it is in Europe. But nonetheless, if he succeeds in Europe, and those who believe as he does succeed in Europe, then the United States will be gravely in peril. And that is what I believe he was referring to when he says, then they themselves will be able to be the ones to disseminate Islam to the world, because they will be able to overcome their foremost obstacle to that dissemination, the United States. Finally, Muqtada Khan of the Center for Islam and Democracy recently noted that Edward Gibbon, the author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, when speaking about the Battle of Tours in 732, had said that if the Franks had not won the Battle of Tours, then the interpretation of the Quran would now be taught in the schools of Oxford, and their pulpits might demonstrate to a circumcised people the sanctity and truth of the revelation of Muhammad. So Gibbon, Muqtada Khan says that he reflected on this while sitting in a coffee shop in Oxford looking at the splendid domes and tall minarets of the two large mosques that have recently been built there. And that he says this, Gibbon would have been surprised to learn the lesson that military defeats do not stop the advance of civilizations, and the globalization of Islam is unimpeded by the material and military weakness of the Muslim world. I would suggest that it is a vital question for the survival of our own nation and our own civilization that we consider his words very carefully in all their implications and act accordingly. Thank you.